In this presentation, we will address Metatron's latest video entitled University Study Proves Me Right on Ancient Egyptians, Tomb of Seti I. To be clear, in this presentation, the term Black African refers to populations who would be classified as Black under contemporary Western standards. This includes, but is not limited to, populations in modern-day Upper Egypt, particularly those from Aswan, as well as Sudanese, Ethiopians, Kenyans, Fulani, and other indigenous groups inhabiting the Sahel and stretch of the Nile River. Throughout this presentation, I will primarily use the indigenous names such as Kemet to refer to the nation, Remet for ancient Egyptians, and Neisi for Nubians. My position is that ancient Kemet was a Black African civilization, founded by Black Africans in Upper Egypt and Lower Sudan. It was a multi-ethnic society comprised primarily of indigenous African populations, with a minority of Asiatics who were largely confined to the Delta region. Pharaonic kingship was established in the southern regions nearly half a millennium before the Delta was absorbed into the southern monarchy. Moreover, the unification of Seti and Shimau occurred well before the formal unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The further back one goes in the chronology, the less Asiatic influence there is in the Delta, which remained under the dominion of the Southern Pharaonic Kingdom up until the incursions of the First, Second, and Third Intermediate periods.
Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong.
To your credit, Metatron, I noticed you have shifted positions slightly. It would seem you have abandoned your half-baked tan theory, which to me is progress.
Now, if you really want to talk about the ethnicity, whatever, yeah, the queen had dark skin. Totally. I think this is a typical inhabitant of the Delta. I'll get hatred for it, I don't care. And this is a typical inhabitant of Nubia, and maybe of some Egyptians, a certain percentage within the Egyptian population clusters in Upper Egypt, which bordered with Nubia, for obvious reasons. That could be also a representation of an Egyptian.
We are more or less in agreement here. Yet I sense your reluctance to admit the obvious, that both the Egyptian and the Nubian fall within the classification of a Black African. To illustrate this point, we refer to the anthropological findings from Professor Christopher Ehret's 2023 study.
In 2023, Christopher Ehret reported that the physical anthropological findings from the major burial sites of those found in locales of ancient Egypt in the 4th millennium BCE, notably El Badari, as well as Nakada, show no demographic indebtedness to the Levant. Ehret specified that these studies revealed cranial and dental affinities with closest parallels to other long-time populations in the surrounding areas of northeastern Africa, such as Nubia and the northern Horn of Africa.
With that being said, I must admit, I am disappointed, but not surprised. Once again, rather than engaging with the most compelling arguments from us, Afrocentrics, you focus on superficial distractions and inconsequential details that do not advance your position. If you truly value historical integrity, then why do you repeatedly dodge the central points of contention and rely on a narrowly focused study, while ignoring the broader body of evidence that directly challenges your position? If your video was simply a neutral exploration of the study you referenced, I would have absolutely no problem with it. But you chose to frame it as a rebuttal to the Afrocentric position, and unfortunately for you, it fails to challenge anything of substance. The study does nothing to undermine the overwhelming body of evidence supporting the African foundations of Nile Valley civilization. Instead, it devolves into superficial banter over the particular shade of brown chosen for the complexion of the couple. Was it dark brown or was it light brown? Either way, it's a trivial distinction that does nothing to challenge the clearly African identity of the people depicted.
I'm afraid that you're not only a delinquent in African history, you're delinquent in African folklore.
I suggest raising the bar and engaging with the core arguments rather than ducking them. Arguments formed from the totality of the genetic studies, anthropological data, cultural continuity, and primary sources, rather than falling back on surface-level rebuttals. Anything less isn't historical analysis. It's performative theater, crafted to project a sense of victory to your followers, rather than to engage meaningfully with the evidence. or even to deepen your own understanding of Nile Valley history. These shallow takes and personal vendetta pieces don't move the conversation forward. They simply feed red meat to your base and inflate your ego, all while leaving the historical record untouched. I urge you to move past this type of cheap clickbait content and confront the substance of the conversation, even if it costs you a few unsubscribes. If truth is truly your goal, then lead with research, not with rhetoric. You begin your video by claiming that the Afrocentric argument rests largely on the idea that the paint on temple walls has faded and was originally darker in color. You then dismiss skin tone as one of the least interesting aspects of an ancient civilization, only to dedicate an entire 20-minute video to that very subject. The irony is hard to ignore.
I think you have emphasized too much the word black, and we made the same mistake. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture.
Instead of engaging with the wide range of serious, well-supported arguments presented by me and other content creators, such as King's Monologue, Trill Black, and Quelamika, you ought to target this superficial claim, as if it were the cornerstone of the entire discourse. This fits a familiar pattern, a distraction from what actually matters, using rhetorical sleight of hand to avoid grappling with the deeper historical, cultural, and scientific evidence that places ancient Egypt firmly within its African context. You'll then attempt to position yourself above the so-called culture war, all while pinning rage bait commented by you to the top of the comment section, designed to provoke outrage among your followers and fuel the very culture war you claim to rise above. These tactics are transparent, and your words ring hollow. This isn't an honest effort to uncover anything of intellectual value. It is a petty attempt to recover from a previous exchange in which your arguments were thoroughly dismantled. Most revealing was your reference to the deeply flawed, and dare I say, deliberately misleading, 2017 Schulman study, which has faced substantial scholarly criticism for its faulty methodology, limited sampling, and glaring misunderstandings of ancient Egyptian chronology and geography. Yet, you've offered no meaningful response or defense. This is a massive red flag, as it illustrates a pattern of willingness to engage in frivolous quarrels, while avoiding the substantive questions that lie at the heart of the historical debate. Instead of grappling with the genetic data, which is a cornerstone of the Afrocentric position, you cling to distractions. A safe terrain where nuance is easily replaced by mockery. It's not scholarship, it's evasion dressed as critique. Now that we've cut through the distractions and cleared away the rhetorical fluff, let us turn to what truly matters: the evidence, the context, and the historical record, each of which demands serious and honest engagement. I will not dignify your imagined victory with a full rebuttal, because there is nothing of substance to respond to. The study you presented may be interesting in its own right, but it is hardly the devastating refutation you make it out to be. At best, it's a minor footnote. At worst, it's an act of intellectual misdirection meant to conceal your inability or refusal to confront the real evidence. I will, however, comment on a few of the more obvious misdirections made in your presentation before broadening the scope of this particular subject and exploring more tombs to see if we can establish any commonalities or distinctions between the various populations depicted on the tomb walls.
And here we see a bunch of Egyptians. Once again, do remember that, as we have proven with the study from the University of Florence, their colors would have been lighter. We can kind of even see it here a little bit.
It would seem you are being deceptive here, or simply mistaken. The paper makes one thing unmistakably clear: the darkening of the wall fragment from the tomb of Seti, the first, occurred only after it was removed from Egypt and transported to Europe. a point yourself even acknowledge. This was not a natural aging process within the tomb, but the direct result of misguided restoration and academic tampering. The image you are referring to is still present within the tomb and did not undergo the rigorous process which caused the slight darkening of the portion of the wall which was removed and relocated. So no, there is nothing to suggest that their colors would be lighter. Nowhere in the paper does it suggest that such darkening is widespread across Egyptian antiquities. On the contrary, the study underscores just how unique this case is. The discoloration, repainting, and pigment alteration, and any darkening were all caused by the academics themselves. This is an isolated incident shaped by extremely specific conditions. It does not reflect a natural aging process, nor does it undermine the broader visual or historical record. If anything, it highlights a much deeper issue: how outside interference has often distorted, damaged, or erased the integrity of African heritage under the guise of preservation. Your attempt to use this single highly unusual case, where pigment darkened instead of faded, as proof that Afrocentrics have it backwards, is not just unconvincing, it's intellectually dishonest. Presenting this outlier as representative is a distortion of the facts, not a rebuttal. Even now, despite all that damage, the figure still clearly depicts two highly melanated individuals with African features, textured hair, and aesthetic markers rooted in Nile Valley culture. The argument doesn't disprove the African roots of ancient Kemet and collapses under the weight of its own evidence. Rather than refuting African identity, the image reaffirms it.
Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong.
But what do the living ancestors of the pharaohs still living in Egypt have to say about the subject?
My local guide in Aswan is Fatima Mohammed Subhi. She studied Egyptology, and I ask her if she believes the ancient Egyptians were black.
I believe, yes, they were not white, but black because they always painted in dark red, not white at all. So this is a color which we have, different colors of black.
Was it an African civilization?
I believe, of course, the southern, the kings comes from the south. They were more similar, or looks like me and you. If you go more southern, you are more darker, so it's more African.
So this is why it's wrong to just show one image of a wall and call it a day. You need to show multiple.
Indeed. And we shall start off by showing this image of Libyans taken from the tomb of Ramses III, which depicts the festival of Min. Here we see the Chemihu partaking in a procession of royal attendants at Medinet Habu. As you can see, they are identified by the ostrich feathers they wear on their headdress. But unlike the Libyan from the tomb of Seti, these Libyans are highly melanated, resembling the complexion of the Remech and Nehisi. The pigment on the walls is extremely well preserved when compared to most other temples, and presents an idea of how colorful the temples of ancient Kemet once were. It also gives a clear indication that perhaps the images in the tomb of Seti have been tampered with like so many other Egyptian artifacts. Considering the well-documented history of anti-black sentiment in Egyptology, I certainly would not rule it out. To be clear, the dominant complexions of native Egyptians and Nubians ranged from light brown to dark brown to black. This reflects the same range of skin tones found across African populations today and is consistent with ancient Egyptian self-representation within their artistic canon. In numerous wall reliefs and tomb paintings, Egyptians and Nubians are often portrayed with brown and black skin tones, sometimes in an alternating pattern, a stylistic convention that was frequently, though not universally, employed. All of the phenotypes presented on the tomb walls thousands of years ago can today be found within Black Africa. These visual traditions highlight the indigenous diversity of Nile Valley populations and should be interpreted through the lens of cultural continuity with present-day African peoples, rather than through modern racial classifications imposed by Eurocentric frameworks. Next, we will look at a relief of Euput II, a Meshwish king of the 23rd dynasty. Although the color has faded, his short coiled hair, tropical limb proportions, and strong African features make his ethnic makeup pretty obvious. which also raises concern for this next statue, who mainstream academics claim to be a Libyan princess, Takashit, which translates to the Kushite. By the looks of her large afro twisted into short locks, we start to see a pattern begin to emerge, and the identity of these so-called white Libyans are called into question. In the Tomb of Ramses, Book of Gates, 4th Division, Lower Register, Scene 30, the term remech is used to identify the Egyptian men depicted on the temple walls. This image, which can be viewed on the Theban Mapping Project website, clearly shows hieroglyphs labeling these individuals as remech, a term referring specifically to native Egyptians. Despite this explicit identification, dishonest scholars claim these men were erroneously labeled and are actually Nubians. The idea that ancient Kemetic scribes would misidentify their own people is not only implausible, it is insulting. Such claims reflect a Eurocentric agenda in the field of Egyptology and the imposition of racial and geopolitical biases onto ancient African civilizations. To assert that the scribes mislabeled Nubians as Egyptians in a scene designed to depict the races of the world is to ignore the cultural, historical, and linguistic integrity of Kemet. This revisionist history prioritizes modern agendas over primary sources, undermining the authority of the very people who produced these texts and images.
Support the channel by tapping that like, subscribe, and notify button to be alerted to new content.
According to the Book of Gates, the Remech and the Nehesi are the children of Ra, or the children of the sun. It states that the Remech were formed from the tears of Ra, while the Nehesi were born from his seed, which emphasizes their ancestral relationship. This mythological account serves to underline the idea of a shared lineage and kinship deeply rooted with the ancient African pastoralists who first populated the Nile Valley. Asiatics and Libyans, on the other hand, were created by Sekhmet, the goddess of war and destruction, implying a more distant or even adversarial origin. This distinction reflects how the Remech viewed themselves and their southern neighbors as part of an extended family, while casting the eastern and western foreigners in a different light, suggesting their classification as external groups within the Egyptian worldview. As Dr. Maria Gatto, a prominent archaeologist and specialist in Northeast African civilizations, emphasizes, Nubia is Egypt's African ancestor, highlighting the foundational role Nubia played in the emergence of Kemetic culture. Dr. Kanya Godde, a biological anthropologist, published a pivotal study in 2018 where she examined the long-term biological relationships between ancient Egyptians and Nubians.
The process of the peopling of the Nile Valley likely shaped the population structure and early biological similarity of Egyptians and Nubians. As others have noted, affinity among Nilotic populations was due to an aggregation of events, including environmental, linguistic, and sociopolitical changes over a great deal of time. This study seeks to evaluate the relationships of Nubian and Egyptian groups in the context of the original peopling event. Cranial non-metric traits from 18 Nubian and Egyptian samples, spanning Lower Egypt to Lower Nubia, and approximately 7,400 years, were analyzed using Mahalanobis d² as a measure of biological distance. A principal coordinates analysis and spatial temporal model were applied to these data. The results reveal temporal and spatial patterning consistent with documented events in Egyptian and Nubian population history. Moreover, the Mesolithic Nubian sample clustered with later Nubian and Egyptian samples, indicating that events prior to the Mesolithic were important in shaping the later genetic patterning of the Nubian population. Later contact through the establishment of the Egyptian fort at Buhen, Kerma's position as a strategic trade center along the Nile, and Egyptian colonization at Tombos maintained genetic similarity among the populations.
The study shows that ancient Egyptians and Nubians were closely related biologically, sharing common ancestry shaped by the early peopling of the Nile Valley. These connections were reinforced over thousands of years through sustained interaction, via migration, trade, and cultural fusion along the Nile River. Rather than rigid ethnic boundaries, the Nile Valley saw continuous intermixing among its inhabitants. Remarkably, a Mesolithic Nubian population, dating to before 6000 BCE, was found to have biological ties with both later Nubian and Egyptian groups. This suggests that the genetic roots of both civilizations run deep and are tightly intertwined, reflecting a shared African heritage that long predates the rise of pharaonic Egypt. These visual images are sacred artistic reconstructions inspired by the legacy, traditions, and ancestral power of ancient Kemet. Every face, artifact, and temple created reflects the African origin of its creators and the timeless memory of their descendants. These are not myths. These are memories restored. Rocket Inc. Productions and Know Thyself Institute present. Black Scroll TV on YouTube. Subscribe, like, and share. Link at the end of this video. The southern origin of Nile Valley culture is illustrated by the many deities within the Kemetic pantheon who were said to have originated in the lands to the south. These regions were known as Ta-Necha, which translates to the land of the gods. The sacred land of Ta-Necha encompassed a region that stretched from the land of Punt to the mountains of the moon located in the Great Lakes region, deep within the heartland of East Africa. The Blue and White Nile, known as the two fathers of plenty, was believed to be the source of all creation, where the great potter, Khnum, molded the first man from the rich alluvial soils. The ethnicity of a faction of the inhabitants of the land of Punt was briefly alluded to in the Festival of Min at Medinet Habu. A man who takes part in the festival recites a hymn to Min, and he is referred to as Nehisi in Puenet, which translates to Nubians of Punt, illustrating the connectivity of these Nubian populations and shared lineage of Ta-Meri, Ta-Necha, and Ta-Seti. Gerald Massey argued that the roots of Egyptian civilization lay deep in equatorial Africa. In this passage from ancient Egypt, The Light of the World, he challenges Eurocentric history and affirms the African origin of the Nile Valley peoples.
The Egyptian record, when correctly read, will tell us plainly that the human birthplace was a land of the papyrus reed, the crocodile, and hippopotamus. A land of the Great Lakes, or in Apta, at the horn point of the earth. That is, in Equatoria, from whence the sacred river ran to brim the valley of the Nile with plenty. The track of civilization with cities springing in its footprints is seaward from the south, not upward from Lower Egypt, which was a swamp when Upper Egypt was already the African home of civilization. Egyptians always gave priority to the south over the delta in the north.
The Nehisi played a significant role in the history of Kemet, contributing to its culture and society. Their interactions were not solely adversarial. Rather, they included trade, intermarriage, and military alliances, showcasing a multifaceted relationship that enriched both civilizations. The portrayal of their connection in Kemetic texts highlights the importance of recognizing Nubia as an integral part of the ancient Egyptian narrative, affirming that both peoples stem from a common lineage that shaped their identities and histories. This relationship was not merely transactional, but deeply cultural, as the political and spiritual ideas that emerged in Nubia significantly influenced the development of early Egyptian civilization. Dr. Christopher Ehret, a distinguished research professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, supports this view, emphasizing the foundational role of Nubian influence.
The coastal elite and ruler, in the second half of the 4th millennium, participated together with their counterparts in the communities of the Nakada culture of southern Egypt in creating the emerging culture and paraphernalia of pharaonic culture.
Now, let me speak to you directly, Metatron, as we return to the heart of the matter. What you present is not a serious counterargument. It is a smokescreen. You avoid the main issues, deliberately replacing substance with spectacle and evidence with innuendo. You deflect, distract, and tap dance around the facts, hoping your audience won't notice that you never actually address the core question: who were the ancient Egyptians? This strategy isn't rooted in a search for truth, but in an effort to muddy the waters. Rather than engage the actual arguments, you spend your energy discrediting the messengers and distracting from the message. If you truly care about truth, about history, about intellectual integrity, then respond to Message to Metatron, Part 1 and 2. Not with theatrics, not with deflections, but point by point, with sources, with evidence, with academic rigor. Address the genetics, address the anthropology, address the primary sources. No more tap dancing, semantics, and mental gymnastics. No more circling the perimeter. It's time to jump in the ring. Because right now, what you're doing isn't analysis, it's evasion, a carefully rehearsed performance designed to give the illusion of engagement while avoiding the substance entirely. So stop performing, step into the arena, confront the evidence, or concede.
Check out our apparel line and become part of the Know Thyself family. We have fresh t-shirts, hoodies, and caps to stay fly and represent the culture. All proceeds go towards the funding of future episodes. Log in with us. www.knowthyselfinstitute.com. Support the channel by tapping that like, subscribe, and notify button to be alerted to new content.